In Matthew chapter 27, as we've been talking about for a while, it talks about starting in verse 21. It says, well, what shall I do with Jesus? And in verse 21, it says, shall I release Barabbas to you or Jesus? And they say Barabbas. And then in verse 22, he says, well, what do I do with Jesus? And they say crucify him. And so what we're doing is we're looking through to see, what shall we do with Jesus? What will I do with Jesus? And so today we're looking through, as we've looking through the different people of Acts. And so we come across Aquila and Priscilla. And if you have an outline, I hope you do. The reason why I hope you do is because we have 11 points. And last week we had 5. And so if you're looking and thinking, man, I'm done at 5, you're going to be sadly mistaken. We have 11, guys, and we'll get through them. And we're not going to camp out on every point, but we're going to go through these. But if you have an outline, it says at the top of it says a study of Aquila and Priscilla. And then it says to be like Priscilla and Aquila, we must. And the reason, if you looked at it, it's got a difference of order. And if you've noticed that, the Bible has a difference of order as well. But it always has them together. In chapter 18 of Acts is where we're going to be camping out for most of the day. But in Acts chapter 18, I'm going to read a few verses from Acts chapter 18 and then talk about some others as it talks about Aquila and Priscilla. It says, and he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus. Recently had come from Italy with his wife Priscilla. And then if you looked in verse 18, it says, after this, Paul stayed many days longer and then took leave with the brothers and set sail for Syria, and with him Priscilla and Aquila. So now we have a difference of order. It says in verse 26, he began to speak boldly in the synagogue in verse 26, when Priscilla and Aquila heard him. And then we see back in Romans 16, or ahead in one book, Romans chapter 16, verse 3, it says, greet Priscilla and Aquila. If you were to look, and you can jot these down, but if you were to look in 1 Corinthians 16, the last chapter there, it says, the church, in verse 19, the churches of Asia send you greetings, Aquila and Priscilla, together with the church in their house. And the last we have, 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 19, it says, greet Priscilla and Aquila. Now, it's interchangeable. It doesn't matter the order. And some have said, the order is because the person that was working more, that was more invested, was Priscilla. We don't know. But what we do know is they were together. And they were, as it talks about in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, it talks about don't be unequally yoked. Well, this is a group, they really get it spiritually. And they're equally yoked. And so they're able to sharpen each other. There's times when you just feel like you just need some encouragement. And so Priscilla and Aquila are able to do this. And so the first point is they just continue. Every time we read about them, they're continuing to do something. And so that's the point made. It's continue. Point number 1, they continue together. That every time you hear them, they're together. And so they're very much part of the work. And we've read these verses that talk about that, describe that. It talks about marriage, how what God has joined, let no man separate there in Mark chapter 10. So he's saying, man, there should be no distance between you. I was talking about a story in class about this person. I just really thought I just misread the room. Sometimes you misread things, and I really misread it. If you weren't there, this lady was talking about, our past that we shared and all these different things, and just saying, and it seemed like she was just going to come out and say that she really liked me. She's going to send an email and let me know what I thought about that. So I really read it completely wrong, because all she was wanting to do was tell me about a nonprofit she wanted me to be a part of. And by doing that, I went ahead and said, I really, I'm kind of taken. That's not going to happen. And then she was really kind of confused. And then I was embarrassed, and she was embarrassed. Well, Priscilla and Aquila, there is no space between them. There's nobody going to sit there and come up and say something, because they know they are joined together. And as it goes, they're always together. You think about that. I've talked about how you can teach someone, and I've talked about the different places where I go. I've got to be careful when I go. When I go to some place, I want to make it a public place. If and it's public, it needs to be public if it's just one person. And so if it's one person, guy or girl, it's always a public place. And if it's a girl, it's especially a public place. And so I always go to a place of eating because there's always people eating. And so I'll go and I'll do that because it's not going to be something where someone is saying something that happened inappropriately with this person that I'm studying with. But if you have a pair, a man and a woman, you can go anywhere. You can go to that person's house, that lady's house, and study. You can go to that coffee shop. You can go anywhere because all of a sudden, together, you meet everything that's going to come up against you. And so they're always together. There's support there. And so that marriage took on something because they're one and the same. They're lockstep in with Christ. Point number 2, as you look there in chapter 18, verse 2 that we read earlier, it says that it was Aquila and then his wife Priscilla. It also talks about, and it says they were commanded to leave Rome. Now, when they left Rome, it's very similar to what takes place that we can see by their actions, what takes place there in Acts chapter 8, when a persecution arose, and it says they scattered. And everywhere they scattered, they preached the word of the Lord. So these people were forced out of their home. And when they're forced out, they don't keep quiet. They start teaching what we're going to see. So point number 2 is they continue to teach. They continue to reach somebody. And if we would all, each one reach one, you think about what we would be doing. I mean, it would just be exploding. And so that was their point. They were kicked out of Rome, but they were scattered out, and they didn't stop their faith. Their faith didn't stop based on the circumstances. They continued. They continued together. They continued to teach. Point number 3 is, you can find that in verse 3. They continued to labor. It says, because he was of the same trade, talking about Paul, he stayed with them and worked, for they were tent makers by trade. So they're working. They're not just sitting there just saying, well, I don't know what's going on here, and we got kicked out, and I guess we're going to panhandle a little bit. No, they have a skill, and they're using that skill. They're building tents. They're working hard. And so they end up meeting Paul there, and he stays with them, which is pretty interesting. They stay together, and at that point, you look at it talks about in 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 10, if you don't work, you shouldn't eat. And so they very much understand that we need to work. We need to get busy. And so they're together, they're teaching, they're laboring. And then as it goes down when this is taking place, then it kind of goes into what Paul's doing in verse 4, how he's reasoning in the synagogue. But as you go to verse 18, it picks up again. And it says that after this, Paul stayed many days longer and took leave of the brothers and set sail for Syria, and with them Priscilla and Aquila. And so they go. And so that's point number 4. They continue to go. They continue to do the work of the Lord. It talks about in Matthew chapter 28, verses 19, it says, go into all nations. And so they very much understand that you can't just stay here. I've got to go share this with somebody. This is too important to let it go. We've talked about many times about this world being upside down. How good is evil and evil is good. But the only thing that's going to change it is teaching about Jesus. And the only thing that's going to help us teach is if we go. We go to some place that's not working. I was talking not too long ago, and I just said, man, I had a chance to visit with some people this past weekend that were some fired up Christians. And I was just thinking, man, if we could get all these people together. It's kind of like when people go off to camp. And they think, man, if we could just stay all together and do all these different things. Man, think about what we could do. Well, I think what would happen is you would stay together and you'd enjoy just spending time together. And you'd be encouraged with that, but it would be hard to go. It'd be hard to go share that with somebody else because you just enjoy this so much. It's kind of like a family reunion, and then there's a knock at the door that the neighbor's wanting something. Come on, man, this is our family reunion. And so very much, when you look at that, when you think about us being together, man, it's great. It's encouragement. That's what we're doing today. But we've got to make sure we go. When we leave, that sign that says, now entering the mission field right above the doors, we've got to make that a reality. That needs to be something, not just some mantra, not just something that is something good to do, but something that God said to do. So they understood to go. Point number 5 is found in verse 19. It says, and there they came to Ephesus, and he left them there. So the point is, they continue to stay. Not just willing to go, they continue to go to these places to help, but they're also continuing to stay. 1 Corinthians 15, verse 58 says, be immovable, steadfast, always abound in the work of the Lord. And I think sometimes just doing the same thing day after day can get old. And sometimes our faith, we see it just not growing anymore. We stagnant. And what we're doing, we've been doing all these years, or sometimes we look at our faith and it's not what it used to be. And they had the staying power to where Paul could leave them in an area and they would just work that area. And you think about that. A couple can go anywhere. There's no place that's off limits. If it was me and a guy and we're going to study with a girl, they might be a little intimidated, but if it's a man and a woman, you can go anywhere. And so they continued, they stayed there in Ephesus and they worked and they helped. And then as it goes down, it talks about in verse 24, now a Jew named Apollos was native of Alexandria, came to Ephesus. And he was an eloquent man, competent in the scriptures. And he had been instructed in the way of the Lord. And being fervent in spirit, he spoke and taught accurately the things concerning Jesus, though he only knew the baptism of John. Well, there's a lot of people. They've got a lot of the gospel down, and it's right, it's biblical. But then there's just some little areas that is not exactly what God's saying. Well, you see Priscilla and Aquila, they don't just let it go and say, man, he got 99% of it. They go and they try and they help. And it says in verse 26, he began to speak boldly in the synagogue, but when Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they took him aside and explained to him the way of God more accurately. And so we see several points here. Point number 6 is they continued to know. They were leaning on the Lord's word. They continue to know. It's very similar to 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 15, where it says, study to show yourself approved. A worker that doesn't need to be ashamed. So they are sharing what they know there. They continue to know. So they're leaning on God's word as they're helping Apollos. And they invited him. And now it says that he was boldly speaking. And it says he was eloquent. And sometimes you think, well, man, I'm not eloquent and I don't speak that way. And so I could never, and you fill the blank in. Well, they didn't stop. It doesn't say anywhere in the text that Priscilla and Aquila are great teachers. It doesn't say it. But it does say that they took them aside and explained to them some things. And so for us, we can't look and say, man, this person, they're great. They're great at that. I could never, go and say, hey, I think there's an area that I'd like to show you, to explain, to maybe tell you about, or maybe ask you some questions on. Sometimes we feel like we can't do it. They didn't stop with this man who has a talent for speaking. They go and they reach him. And so they continue on in verse 7. It says, they explained the way of God more accurately, so they continued to correct. They taught Apollos. They didn't just leave it, because if you love someone, you're going to teach them. You don't just let it go. If you love someone and you care about their future, you can't help but share with them the gospel. And once again, in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 15, it says correctly handling the word of truth. And so knowing it is one thing and telling it is completely something else. And a lot of times we think about what it talks about when Paul writes the church of Corinth, that knowledge puffs up. And we think, man, we got the answers. We got all the answers. Well, I'll tell you, I don't have all the answers right now. But that's what knowledge does. It puffs a person up. But if you keep reading the verse, it says, but love builds up. And there's a difference between having all the answers. You can know all the answers, but the way you come across, nobody wants to listen to you. Well, they had the answers, and he understood they cared about him. So there was obviously some type of connection. The way they approached him was different than saying, hey, buddy, in the crowd, you're wrong, harassing him and saying all these different things, hateful to him. I've been to some different places. And I remember teaching at a place in Florida. They had me come down, and I was teaching them how to teach. And as I'm there, this guy in the crowd says, well, I don't like that way you do it. And I said, well, I understand. I mean, there's some things I don't like about it. So, what do you think? What do you use? Well, I don't really, use anything. Well, I don't like a lot of the things that I'm doing here. It just, maybe it's not fluid because it's me doing it, but I like it a whole lot better than what you're doing because you're not doing anything. You're not even trying to do something. And I remember as we talked about it, he wanted to know a percentage. Well, what's the percentage of people that are baptized after you study with them? And it was quite high, and I didn't want to really get into it because then you're kind of bragging, right? Because it has nothing to do with me. It's about the power of God's word. So I said, well, what's yours? And he was spouting off, and I think it wasn't very good. And I just thought, well, why are we even talking about this? I said, I'm not going to get into these number of things because all of a sudden you've now made it about a person instead of the man. And that's what happens when you try to correct someone sometimes if you don't do it in the right spirit. He came across all wrong, and I didn't have a thing to do with him afterwards. I didn't want to be around that guy. And everybody else in the group looked and thought, oh, who invited this fella? What's he doing here? Well, that's not the way Priscilla and Aquila did it. They did it in love. They did it in humility, going to him. And if they hadn't, and I can infer that, and the reason I say that, because if they hadn't, he wouldn't have listened, because he's a guy who's greatly skilled. Now, as you keep going, we go to Romans. Romans chapter 16, the last chapter of the book. Romans chapter 16. Verse 3, it says, greet Priscilla and Aquila, my fellow workers in Christ Jesus. Well, point number 8, they continue to work. They're going to be working no matter if he's there or not. Some people, they only work if you're around them. They're only going to do something if you're there. So, for instance, growing up, I'm not going to mow the yard on my own. I'm not even going to think about the yard. But my mom would say, hey, it's time to mow the yard. Oh, okay. So I would go mow the yard. And I certainly wouldn't take out the trash. Well, it's time to I'll take the trash out. I thought I could get another day away without having to take the trash out, but nope, got to take the trash out. There's some things that unless someone's there, you're not going to do it. Priscilla and Aquila are right there helping each other along the way because I'm sure at one point, one of them didn't feel like doing something. But they just spur each other to love and good works, as it talks about in Hebrews. And so they continue to help each other. And when Paul's there, when he's not, obviously they are back in Rome. At this point, it seems like the timeline they talk about, most likely they've gone back to Rome because Claudius would have died. So they would have most likely trekked back there. And if that's the case, he's saying, hey, they're back in Rome. Hey, greet them because they're my fellow workers. Man, they know how to work. So that's point number 8. Continue to work. They continue to work in spite of who's with them and who's not with them. John 9, verse 4 says, work while it's light. In other words, work while you can work. Do it while you can. There's too many people put off things. And as a young kid, my mom wanted me to mow the grass or take out the trash. I would have waited. I'd have waited and kept putting that thing off. And then I'd have said, well, the grass is too high now. We're just going to have to leave it, and just have, some woods out in our front yard. So the whole point is do it while you can do it. You've got energy right now. You've got ability right now. You got to do it while you can. Because if you put that off teaching someone, if you put that off the good works that you could be doing until later, that later is never going to come around. That's not what Priscilla and Aquila. If you ask them what they could do for Jesus, well, they're going to continue together. And they're going to continue to teach. They're going to continue to labor. They're going to continue to go. They're going to continue to stay when they need to stay. They're going to continue to know, correct. They're going to continue to work. And then point number 9. Look in verse 4 of this chapter. It says, not just did a Priscilla and Aquila, not just are they fellow workers. It says they risked their necks for my life, to whom not only I give thanks, but all the churches of the Gentiles give thanks as well. It's because they were involved in everybody's life. You think about these people, because I think, and I'm thankful for my folks that taught me the gospel. And I'm thankful for their folks. And somewhere down the line, someone, as we've talked before, someone taught my family the gospel, and I'm thankful for that person. And someone in your family, you may know the person, the first person that obey, you're the first person in your family to obey the gospel. So you know who brought the gospel to your family. Or it may be a few generations, but you know. And you're thankful for whoever that is, whether you know the name or not, or it's just some person you know is in history that helped. This would be Priscilla and Aquila. Because they helped share. And so all these churches are grateful because of them. Because of them, not just their work, but for what they were able to do to help Paul. Paul was able to go and do other things as well by helping people know about Jesus. It says they risked their life. And so point number 9 is they continue to trust. They continue to trust. They leaned on God. Not just lean on his word, but they lean on God that he's going to take care of them. It talks about in Proverbs 3 verses 5 and 6, don't lean on your own understanding. They didn't. They leaned on God. That's exactly who they should have been leaning on. And too many times I think we focus on what we can see, what we can taste, what we can touch, what we can smell, instead of the creator of the universe. He has promised that he's going to take care of us. He's promised that we have what we need to get to the next life. He's given us everything for life and godliness. So we don't need anything else. And the reward, the investment that we have, it talks about how it's going to be kept undefiled, secure. So we've got an inheritance that's never going to fade away, that's going to be there for us. So why wouldn't we want to continue to trust him? All these other things are going to fade away, but not him. And in verse 5 of this chapter, it says, greet also the church in their home, in their house. So they continue in point number 10, they continue to meet. They continue to be hospitable. 1 Peter 4, verse 9 says, be hospitable and do it without complaining about it. Help everybody and be gracious. Open up your home, open up your life to people. And they're opening up their home so people can come and worship. I've always felt, we were talking, Monica's family and I were talking over a meal, and they were talking about, what would happen, just different scenarios. They were talking about different churches and different things going on. And I said, too many times we focus on this building. We just think this is the end all be all, and we've got to make sure that everything is proper and perfect. And you look here in Romans chapter 16, and man, they're just meeting out of a house. And can you imagine when you open up your life, and all of a sudden when people come into your life, how close you get? I would imagine this congregation that met in their house was close, tight. They knew the struggles that were going on in each other's life because they knew each other. They shared life together. And I look at us when we get in this building, because it never talks about in the first century having a building, because Jesus made it in such a simple way. So if you're persecuted or not, you can have the Lord's church. All you have to do is have some items that you already have in your refrigerator, in your pantry. Unleavened bread and fruit of the vine. And then you don't need any type of instrument to haul around. Don't need a piano. You just got the chords that you carry with you at all times. It's music on the go. And then all you have to do is worship together. He doesn't tell you where to do it. The biggest thing that we have is Solomon's colonnade, where they could have thousands there. But it didn't say they met there every day, but they did meet house to house. They met privately and they met publicly, but they're meeting in each other's homes. And can you imagine if we would do that? If we'd meet in each other's homes, how close we would get with each other and how familiar we would get with each other. And then the next thing you know, man, the house is just too small. And so what do you have to do? Just like there in the first century, we have to have 2 houses now. And now 2 houses aren't big enough. Now we have to have 3 houses to contain us. And it just keeps going, because a lot of people get pretty intimidated when they come to a place of worship. But if you're coming to a house, well, man, yeah, I'll go to a house. Well, that's not a big deal. Yeah, I'll go over there, and then afterwards, we're gonna eat together. We're gonna share a common meal together. And man, you're talking about growing, because people are now coming in just because you're invited. Hey, just come over to the house. When you hear come over to the house, you don't hear anything else but, oh, this is going to be probably some good food. There's being some good family time, and so you go there and you're treated like family. And the next thing you know, you're not the guest anymore. First century church knew how to do it. They didn't get inclusive with this, because what happens in this building is we've already limited ourselves. We've already done the limiting, so God doesn't have to. We've already said this is our capacity right here. This is about what we're comfortable with growing. Now, if we want to do something else, we're going to have to extend the walls, those kind of things, and then we've limited God's growth again. But when you're in a home, you don't have to limit growth. It just keeps going. It's something to think about, because those people, they continued to meet. And all the churches in the area were grateful to them. They met in their home. They opened up their home. They continued to do this. You look in verse 5, it says, greet the church in their house. So all the people that worship there, you see multiple times them doing this. So not only do they continue to meet, but you look over in the last chapter of 1 Corinthians, chapter 16, in verse 19, it says that churches of Asia send you greetings. Aquila and Priscilla, together with the church in their house, send you a hearty greeting in the Lord. Or a hearty greetings in the Lord. Well, remember, they were there. That's where they met. Paul was in Corinth. And so they stayed there for a while. And so he's saying, hey, these churches of Asia send their greeting, and so does Aquila and Priscilla. They know you. They worked with you. They shared life with you. They shared their faith with you. They shared the gospel with you. And they want you to know they're saying hello. And they're thinking about you. No doubt they're praying for you. They're sending you a greeting. And so they continue to remain is point number 11. They continue to remain. So they were in close fellowship with Christians in the church. When they left, they were still in close proximity, not physically, but in spirit. And they were close to them spiritually. And it talks about the same thing when you look over in 2 Timothy. The last book that Paul writes, 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 19, it says, Paul's telling Timothy, greet Priscilla and Aquila. Man, so not only did they remain close to the churches in the areas that they knew of people in, but they also kept in touch with Christians, with the individual Christian, not just the whole group, but the individual. They remained close to Timothy. They remained close to Paul. So looking at that, they were together doing these things. They were working in lockstep, because you say, what shall we do with Jesus? Well, they looked at each other and said, we're going to continue to consider him. Hebrews chapter 12. It says in verse 3, consider him who has endured from sinners such hostility against himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted. It mentions multiple times. It mentions the same thing, not to grow weary, in Galatians chapter 6, verse 9. It's because you're going to reap a harvest if you don't. It mentions in 2 Thessalonians, in chapter 3, verse 13, don't give up. Don't become weary. Don't give up. It mentions these things multiple times. There's a reward coming for those that don't give up. And here in Hebrews 12, it says, consider him. Consider what he has endured. And we hadn't even come close to doing that. But consider him who's endured. When you start thinking about giving up, when you start thinking about this life is just too weary, I'm just worn out, I'm just in too much pain, I'm just too weary, I'm in too much agony, I'm just too weary, I'm exhausted, I'm weary, I'm struggling spiritually, I'm weary, I just don't have the boldness that I once had, I'm weary. I just I feel depressed. I'm weary. Man, I'm feeling anxious because I don't know what's going to happen in this world. Man, I'm weary. Don't become weary or faint-hearted. And when you do, because we're all going to, it says consider him. Consider what he's gone through. Because what he's gone through is nothing compared to what we're going through. No matter the circumstance, no matter the situations, no matter the trials, no matter the storms. And I know we're all going through some. We all have a lot, and I could mention those things. But the point is, what shall you do with Jesus? And I hope you consider him. I hope you consider Jesus, and you decide that no longer will you be weary or faint-hearted, but you'll live for him. So then eventually you'll give your life for him. So then eventually you'll have the reward forever. Now, this is a part that I offer an invitation. So if there's something that you want for us to be praying about, that's what we're going to do. And we're not going to do it just this week, but we're going to continue. And if you want us to put you on the prayer list, we'll do that. Because this is a family that not only needs to be sharing life together, we need to stay together. We need to encourage each other. We need to build each other up. All the more as we see the day approaching. And so, if you're a person that has not put Christ on baptism, then don't just jump in the water and be done with it. Know exactly what is going to be know the cost and what's going to be expected of you. Because he expects you to know, to believe that he is the Son of God and be able to share that. To be able to say without a doubt, yeah, I believe Jesus is the Son of God, as it talks about in Romans chapter 10. To be able to say, yeah, I believe this. And to be able to change your life, as it talks about in Luke 13 and in Acts chapter 2. That you're changing how you want to do things and you're putting him first. You're doing it his way. And then that you're having your sins washed away. You're having a fresh start. You're having a do-over. You have a new lease on life, as it talks about in Romans chapter 6. But don't take my word for it. Look in here. And if you want me to talk about and show you exactly what I know, how a person can be saved, then don't wait, don't hesitate. As I told you before, I'll take a day off of work. I'll take a week off of work. Whatever's needed. But don't wait, don't hesitate, because this is too important. What will you do with Jesus? Please come as we stand and sing.